I'm Shelby Williams with Plano City Council, otherwise known as Babyface Williams. So first, on Saturday, you elected me to another term, 4 more years on Plano City Council, and I thank you very much. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I made some pretty big campaign promises 4 years ago. As an incumbent this time, I had already started working on my new promises, so I will continue driving those as best I can. Now, Saturday, Election Day, was marred, as everybody knows, by the mass shooting in Allen. So I was out poll greeting in the afternoon in Plano when I first heard the reports of the shooting. And those reports kept rolling in. I kept doing my Facebook Lives from the polling locations that I went to and providing what very little information I knew at the time that I could share about the shooting. There are really no words for it. I reached out to many of the folks I knew on Allen City Council, and it was a dark, dark, dark time. And then the very next morning, we heard reports that almost exactly the same number of people were murdered and injured by a guy in Brownsville using a car. If you take away nothing else, take away that evil exists in this world, and we can't wish it away, we have to deal with it. On a little bit lighter note, we then moved forward the next day to a city council meeting, a joint meeting with planning and zoning, which a lot of people have been waiting for. So this was to consider an interim ban on short-term rentals. So I'm actually going to go through the rest of the few items that we discussed that last night. That night, and this is actually, I didn't get to my video on that night. It was last night. I even dressed up in the same suit and tie to record this. So how's that for transparency? I'm going to cover these items first. In the preliminary open meeting, we discussed programming of ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act funds for public safety for this fiscal year. So the city of Plano received a total of $36.4 million in ARPA funds. That's money that came from the federal government and originally came from your pockets because it's still tax money. Or rather, it hasn't come from your pockets yet. You're paying for it through a combination of debt and inflation, but it is coming from your pockets. Trust me on that. So 36.4 million over 2 years, 2021 and 2022. We have received that money, and then we need to use it quickly so we are able to put it toward public safety for the remainder of this fiscal year. In the regular meeting, we discussed, actually, Council Member Julie Holmer, who also won re-election on Friday, but she was unopposed, so it was kind of a given. She read a statement about the actual today, the day after the council meeting, May 9th being Fentanyl Awareness Day. As many of you know, we recently lost a student in Plano ISD to a fentanyl overdose. What I learned in Councilmember Holmer's statement is that for Americans under the age of 50, fentanyl is the leading cause of death, more than heart disease, suicide, everything. That's a pretty powerful statement. So the biggest danger with fentanyl is that it's so easy to overdose, and there are so many unscrupulous, evil people who are putting fentanyl in fake products, other drugs, and they don't really care whether somebody overdoses or not, or takes as much as they can handle. So this is a really big problem, and of course, as many of you are aware, fentanyl is just pouring across our southern border, along with all sorts of other stuff. So we considered an ordinance to approved the creation of the Hoblitzelle bike trail extension. So this has come up before, not the actual purchase of the contract or the approval of the contract to build the bike trail, but the land that it goes on. So this is behind the Montessori school that we've spoken about so frequently. But then the marquee item on last night's council meeting was the short-term rental ban. So there were actually two things that we were considering. Only one of them involved the joint meeting with planning and zoning. And this actually did cause a lot of confusion. The very first thing that came up, we gavelled in planning and zoning and the council all at the same time, all around the dais. The very first thing that was considered was a registration ordinance for existing short-term rentals. So it's important to point out that the registration ordinance, because of the dates involved in it, is for any short-term rental that existed prior to May 15th. It's looking forward just a little bit because passage of this requires publication, but before May 15th of 2023, or could prove an investment made for a short-term rental, like, hey, I just bought this property to open it up as a short-term rental. What are you doing? Before May 15th of 2023. So the registration ordinance is not just, hey, let's let anybody register their short-term rental, come one, come all. It only applies to short-term rentals that were established and operating or had an investment interest prior to May 15th, 2023. That's just a few days. So this got tabled. Councilman member Grady, for whom this was his very last meeting, he was term limited. He made a motion and I seconded a motion to go ahead and pass it. That failed. And then a motion was made to table this to June 26th to give more time for staff to explore the ramifications of a bill that has recently passed it had already passed the Senate. It's Senate Bill 929 and recently passed the House to give staff more time to evaluate the impacts of that bill. The governor hadn't signed it yet, but it had a couple of provisions in it that staff wanted to explore and are proposing to bring that ordinance back with any revisions on the June 26th meeting. That will end up being another joint meeting, I think, between with Plano City Council and the Planning and Zoning Commission. But what Councilmember Grady and I felt were that we could pass it last night and then bring it forward later with any necessary amendments. Didn't get our way, although actually that's not true. Councilman Grady got his way. This is really pretty cool. He got a sign presented to him, like a street sign, a Plano street sign presented to him by City Manager Israelson and the Mayor, John Munns, so that Rick Grady could get his way. It was called Grady Way, Plano street sign called Grady Way. So Rick Grady and I did not get our way, but Rick Grady got his way. Anyway, hey, triple entendre. The registration ordinance was tabled. This caused a lot of confusion because a lot of citizens who were there for the 4 o'clock start of the joint meeting between City Council and Planning and Zoning, even though we went into an executive session, we didn't even actually start the public portion of it until after 5 o'clock. But all the people who came after that was tabled, many of them left. Probably half of them thought it was all over and they went home. They thought the whole thing was tabled. That was only the first half of it. We had a brief recess, bio break, and just 5 minutes. And when we came back, the crowd had thinned perceptibly. And then was the true joint meeting part where planning and zoning had to go first, because the second part of the meeting was to consider the actual interim ban on any new short-term rentals that crop up after May 15th. Pardon me. So legally, because we have a Planning and Zoning Commission, if we are going to make any changes to the zoning ordinance, the Planning and Zoning Commission first has to issue their report to the City Council. They don't have to pass something, they just have to report on it. Good, bad, ugly, whatever it is, they just have to give us their opinion. And then, and only then, can council consider it. So a motion, so P&Z has to do their part first. So the reason this was a joint meeting was so that we could act on this as quickly as possible. This was the meeting that I first called for after the last shooting we had, not the first, the most recent shooting we had at a short-term rental in Plano. where 30 some odd gunshots rang out. Thank God nobody was hit, but one of the bullets went through the playroom of a 3-year-old girl. She was not in it at the time. It was in the middle of the night, but still, it was a pretty big wake-up call. And so I called for this vote as quickly as we could get it done. Legally, because planning and zoning has to weigh in first, the quickest it could get done is by calling a joint meeting where planning and zoning gets up there, they do their thing, and then they pass their recommendation, or at least they make their recommendation, and then we step onto the dais, city council, and we do our thing with that report that we just got seconds earlier, instead of waiting for the week or more turnaround that we usually have for planning and zoning reports to come before council. Little procedural insight there. So a motion was made very early on in the planning and zoning portion of the meeting to table it. What that would have done was preempt any further action last night by city council. If planning and zoning tabled it until whatever future meeting, city council could not legally then later last night consider what to do about the interim ban. We couldn't even vote on it. We couldn't even discuss it. So the motion was made to table, and I will note that not all of the reasons, but one of the reasons to table was because of the uncertainty of the rest of this legislative session in Austin. It's going to end at the end of the month, well, a couple days before, but the Planning and Zoning Commission is, as Chairman Downs of the Planning and Zoning Commission articulated very early on in last night's P&Z meeting, supposed to look at land use. Well, one of the considerations to table was the concern that if we enacted something last night that might spark the ire of the legislature, then they could tack on something to a bill that's still active, which would invalidate what we just did last night. Not a land use consideration, just not. But the motion to table failed, and then a motion to pass the interim ban as it is was made. That also failed. Both failed 4-4. So with an 8-member body, if a motion is made, it has to receive a majority of votes to pass. So it requires a 5 votes to pass, a 5-vote threshold. If only 4 votes come and it does not get that 5th vote, then the motion simply fails. It doesn't pass. In the end, planning and zoning elected to pass it to Plano City Council without a recommendation, which is going to come to us anyway. So with the motion to table having failed first, we got the report from the Planning and Zoning Commission, and we as City Council were then able to step onto the dais, and we were able to start deliberating on this. And in the end, I think it passed 6-2. Because of the nature of the meeting, we weren't able to use our buttons, so I didn't get to see the tally. We had to do a show of hands. So I think the final vote was 6-2, and we did pass the interim ban on short-term rentals. Now, it has an automatic expiration date of May 15th of next year, 2024, which ostensibly should give us the time where we can go through the survey that's been released, convene the STR task force, and consider, as I've put it before, whether, where, and how short-term rentals might be appropriate in Plano. So, but in the meantime, until we make such a determination, we have the interim ban in place, at least until May 15th, 2024, where any new short-term rentals that did not exist and did not have an investment interest prior to May 15th of this year are not allowed to operate. They are not allowed to crop up. That is now against Plano City Ordinance. Now, we will come back on June 26th to reconsider the registration ordinance. That's what will allow us to capture the information about the existing short-term rentals and provide all of the, I mean, it had it last night, but all of the requirements for having a registration or for renewing a registration. Things such as you have to prove you have paid and are good on your hotel occupancy tax. You have to provide a floor plan, as is required under building code. You have to post notice of your registration at the entrance of the short-term rental. You have to do a handful of things. If you are a party house and you have these issues with your house, you can have your registration revoked. A variety of things. So we're going to reconsider that again on the June 26th meeting, which should be another joint meeting with planning and zoning, but actually it may not be. For the registration, that may just be city council. So don't quote me on the P&Z part of that, but it is June 26th. That date was loud and clear. That's where we will consider the registration. And then once we move forward with the registration, we get all of the information for the short-term rentals that are already operating in Plano. Then we need to make sure they comply. And if they don't, there's a lot of gunfire, brothels, child prostitution, pornography, any of that kind of stuff, then you don't get your registration and you don't have to get it renewed. You're out of the short-term rental business, at least in Plano. So hopefully that should keep the remainder of short-term rentals in Plano behaving very well. And eventually we will, again, explore whether, where, and how short-term rentals might be appropriate in the city. And that's how we left it last night. So it was a significant step forward, and a lot of credit, in fact, all the credit, belongs to the Plano chapter of the Texas Neighborhood Coalition. When I called for this vote initially a couple months ago, I pointed out that this whole issue first came on my radar at the tail end of 2019 when we had a shooting and a murder at a party house, party short-term rental in East Plano. But then very soon after that, the pandemic hit and it just dropped off of our radar. The Plano chapter of the Texas Neighborhood Coalition, pardon me, I'm not going to bother to edit that out. Or that, so just pretend you didn't hear it. The Plano chapter of the Texas Neighborhood Coalition has been showing up to pretty much every city council meeting for more than a year, telling us what a problem this is. And it's not a problem for anybody if there are no short-term rentals around, but it's a problem for everybody when there is. So I thank you all for coming so diligently for more than a year now. We have to come to every council meeting, but we signed up for this. So we know how difficult it is to rearrange your lives around coming to every council meeting. You didn't sign up for it. You did this because it was so important to you and because you wanted to make such a positive difference for Plano. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. That is the essence of what grassroots activism is. And you did it the right way and you moved the needle. So I am Shelby Williams, aka Babyface Williams, with Plano City Council. I want to thank you again, Plano, for re-electing me to allow me to serve you for another 4 years. I will do my very best to make my next 4 years even more impactful than the last 4. So again, thank you very much. And actually, I would be remiss if I did not plug the Plano Sesquicentennial, that's 150-year anniversary, on June 3rd at Haggard Park. That is from 4 to 8 p.m. Plano is 150 years old this year. That is our sesquicentennial. And so we will be celebrating at Haggard Park between 4 and 8 p.m. on Saturday, June 3rd. And we will have all sorts of sesquicentennially themed activities. So please come and join us and celebrate the City of Excellence. Good night, or good morning if you're watching this in the morning, and God bless.